At 90 years old, Margaret Maggie Rose Callahan had lived a life that most could scarcely fathom. She'd been a field nurse during World War II, her hands steadying blood-soaked bandages on battlefields far from home, tying tourniquets amid the whistle of bullets and the cries of dying soldiers. She'd whispered words of comfort to boys too young to shave, their eyes wide with fear as they slipped away under a foreign sky. The war had forged her into something unyielding, a woman of iron resolve, but the decades since had softened her edges, shaping her into a figure of resilience, compassion, and wisdom that belied her frail frame. Now, she lived alone in a weathered gray cottage perched on the edge of Willow Hollow, a quiet rural town where folks still tipped their hats from front porches and swapped stories over coffee at the local diner. Her husband, James, had died 22 years ago, leaving her with memories etched into every corner of the home he'd built with his own calloused hands. Their 3 children grown and gone lived in cities scattered across the map, their phone calls frequent, but their visits rare. Maggie didn't mind too much. She had her routines, tending the vibrant flower garden that spilled over her yard, reading novels yellowed with age, and sorting through the stack of letters her grandchildren sent, each one bundled with a green ribbon and tucked in her bedside table. For years, this had been enough. But lately, the peace she'd cultivated had begun to fray, unraveling like a thread pulled loose from a seam. It started subtly, the way a storm gathers on the horizon before it breaks. A few months back, a biker gang called the Iron Talons had roared into Willow Hollow. At first, they kept to the town's fringes, their engines snarling through the pine woods or echoing from late-night gatherings down by the creek. The townsfolk grumbled about the noise, the empty beer cans littering the roadside, but the sheriff gray-haired and weary lacked the manpower to push back, and the town council turned a blind eye, hoping the trouble would blow over. For a while, it seemed it might. Then the bikers found Maggie. The harassment began with small, petty acts. One morning, she found a whiskey bottle smashed against her stone walkway, its amber shards glinting in the dawn light. Another day, cigarette stubs dotted her peony beds, and candy wrappers fluttered against her porch steps, caught in the breeze. Irritating, yes, but nothing she couldn't sweep away with a sigh and a shake of her head. She'd faced worse than litter in her time, but the intrusions grew bolder. Soon, they came at night, their motorcycles growling just beyond her fence, the sound vibrating through her walls and rattling the china in her kitchen cabinets. Sometimes, they'd aim their headlights through her bedroom window, the harsh beams slicing across her quilt and painting jagged shadows on the plaster. Maggie wasn't one to flinch easily. War had burned fear out of her long ago, but even she couldn't ignore the unease that settled into her aging bones. Still, she wouldn't be driven from the home James had poured his heart into. So, one humid evening, after an especially raucous chorus of engines and jeering laughter shattered her quiet, she slipped on her faded house shoes, gripped her oak cane, and stepped onto her porch. The air smelled of gasoline and honeysuckle, a strange marriage of menace and memory. Across the street, the bikers lounged, their silhouettes dark against the flickering street lamp. "Don't you fellas have anything better to do than pester an old lady?" she called, her voice steady, cutting through the night like a blade honed by time. The group burst into laughter, a harsh, barking sound that rolled across the yard. One of them swaggered forward, a towering figure with arms sleeved in tattoos, a coiled rattlesnake inked across his forearm. A cigarette dangled from his lips, and his eyes gleamed with mockery as he sized her up. "Just having a little fun, Granny," he drawled, his tone dripping with disdain. "This place, this land, it ain't meant for folks like you no more. Oh well, jack up and left. You oughta follow his lead." Maggie's gaze sharpened. She'd heard the whispers around town. Some slick developer from the city had been sniffing around, waving cash at landowners along the hollow. She'd turned down every offer flat, her refusal as firm as the foundation beneath her feet. This cottage wasn't just a house site, it was a tapestry of her life, woven with threads of love, loss, and endurance. The bikers weren't random thugs, she realized. They were pawns, sent to nudge her out when money couldn't. But Maggie Callahan didn't bend, not for greed, not for threats. That stubbornness, she'd soon learn, carried a price. Days crept by, then a week. The iron talons didn't relent, they escalated. Each time Maggie ventured outside, she found fresh evidence of their spite. A garden hose sliced clean through, garbage bags torn open and strewn across her back stoop. The porcelain dove that had graced her front steps for decades now shattered into jagged fragments, its wings broken beyond repair. She swept up the messes, her lips pressed tight, but the weight of it gnawed at her. Then came that Saturday evening, a turning point she couldn't brush aside. The sun hung low, bathing the porch in a warm golden glow as the scent of marigolds drifted through the air. Maggie was rinsing a teacup in the kitchen when she heard the low, predatory rumble of engines. Not one or two this time, but a half dozen at least. They roared up the lane, a pack unleashed, and she moved to the front window, her cane tapping softly against the hardwood. Her hand trembled, just a flicker, as she watched. The talons didn't stop at the road. They veered onto her lawn, tires chewing through the soft soil, ripping apart her flower beds, and flattening the late-blooming zinnias she'd nursed through the summer. One rider popped a wheelie, his rear tire flinging clumps of dirt onto her porch with a cackle. Another pulled a spray can from his jacket and scrawled a message across her picket fence in dripping crimson paint. Leave. That was the moment Maggie understood. This wasn't about fear, Anna Maria. It was a forced eviction, a siege meant to break her. She didn't weep or shout. Instead, she turned from the window, her jaw tight, her mind sparking with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. She crossed the living room, past the sepia-toned photo of her and James on their wedding day, him in his press suit, her in a simple lace dress, past the shadow box on the wall, displaying her faded Red Cross pin from the war. In the corner stood an old rotary phone, its black finish chipped but functional, a relic from the life she'd shared with James. Her fingers, gnarled by time, dialed a number she hadn't touched in over 40 years. It rang once, then a gravelly voice answered. "Yeah, it's Maggie Callahan," she said, her tone cool and unshaken. "I'm cashing in that favor." A pause, a breath on the other end. "We're coming. Hold steady." The line clicked dead. Outside, the talons kept at it, tearing ruts into her yard, their laughter ringing like a taunt. They had no clue what she'd set in motion, no inkling of who she'd summoned, or the storm now bearing down on them. 26 minutes later, a new sound cut through the dusk, heavier, deeper, a rumble that pulsed with purpose. The talons froze, their jeers dying as they squinted down the road. Around the curve came a line of nearly 24 motorcycles, their engines a rolling thunderclap, their riders clad in black leather jackets adorned with a silver crest, a hawk clutching a dagger. The steel sentinels had arrived. The air in Willow Hollow thickened as the steel sentinels rolled to a stop, their engines cutting off one by one, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. The iron talons, caught mid-rampage on Maggie Callahan's lawn, exchanged uneasy glances. Their laughter had evaporated, replaced by the tense shuffling of boots and the faint clink of chains dangling from their belts. Maggie stood at her window, her cane a steady anchor, watching as the two groups faced off. At 90, she'd seen enough of life to know this wasn't just a standoff, it was a reckoning. The leader of the Sentinels dismounted first, a broad-shouldered man with a salt and pepper beard and eyes like chipped flint. His leather jacket creaked as he moved, the silver hawk and dagger emblem catching the last rays of the setting sun. Maggie recognized him instantly, even after all these years. Daniel Hawk Grayson, a medic she'd worked alongside in the chaos of the war. Back then, he'd been a wiry kid with a quick laugh, stitching up soldiers under fire while she held the lantern. They'd saved each other's lives more than once, and when the war ended, he'd sworn he'd repay the debt if she ever called. She hadn't tunnel now. Hawk strode forward, his boots crunching the gravel, and stopped at the edge of Maggie's ruined lawn. The Talon's leader, a tattooed brute with a rattlesnake ink, stepped up to meet him, his cigarette still smoldering between his lips. "This ain't your turf, old man," he sneered, puffing smoke into the air. "Right on back where you came from." Hawk didn't flinch. "This land belongs to Maggie Callahan," he said, his voice low and deliberate, like the roll of distant thunder. "You've got no claim here. Pack up your trash and go, or we'll make you." The talons bristled, hands twitching toward knives and tire irons tucked into their belts. There were 6 of them, outnumbered 3-1 by the sentinels, but bravado kept them rooted. The tattooed leader spat into the dirt and grinned, showing stained teeth. "You think a bunch of gray-haired relics scare us? We're the future of this town. She's just a fossil sitting on prime real estate." Maggie's grip tightened on her cane. She'd heard enough. Pushing open her front door, she stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under her slight weight. Every eye turned to her, Hawks, steady and proud, the talons mocking and cruel. "This fossil," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel, "buried better men than you before you were born. You don't own this town, and you sure as hell don't own me." A ripple of laughter ran through the sentinels, but the talon's leader wasn't amused. He tossed his cigarette into her shredded flower bed and took a step closer, his bulk looming. "Big talk for Granny on her last legs. That developer's gonna pave over this dump whether you're here or not. We're just speeding things up." Hawk moved faster than his years suggested, planting himself between Maggie and the biker. "Last chance," he growled. "Leave, or we bury you in her roses." The standoff held for a heartbeat, then snapped. The talon's leader lunged, swinging a fist at Hawk, but the older man sidestepped with practiced ease and drove an elbow into the biker's jaw. The crack of bone echoed, and chaos erupted. The sentinels surged forward, a disciplined wall of leather and steel, while the talons scrambled into a messy brawl. Fists flew, boots stomped, and the air filled with grunts and the dull thud of bodies hitting the ground. Maggie watched, unflinching, as the men she'd called tore through her tormentors. One Talon went down with a busted nose. Another sprawled unconscious after a sentinel's knee found his gut. The spray painter tried to bolt, but 2 sentinels hauled him back by his jacket, slamming him into the fence he'd defaced. It was over in minutes. The talons, battered and groaning, lay scattered across the lawn like fallen leaves. Their leader, clutching a swelling jaw, glared up at Hawk, who stood over him, breathing steady. "Get your boys and crawl out of here," Hawk said. "Next time, we won't stop at bruises." The talons staggered to their bikes, engines sputtering to life as they peeled out, leaving ruts and a cloud of dust behind. The sentinels didn't cheer, they just watched, silent and resolute, until the last growl faded into the night. Hawk turned to Maggie, his expression softening. "You okay, Mags?" She nodded, stepping down from the porch with careful deliberation. "Better now. Didn't expect you to bring the whole crew." "Didn't plan to," he said, a faint grin tugging at his lips. "Word got around it was for you. Half these guys owe you their granddad's lives. Couldn't keep him away." Maggie's eyes swept over the sentinelsmen and a few women, some graying, some younger, all wearing that same hawk and dagger patch. She recognized a few faces, sons and daughters of soldiers she'd patched up in the war. Her past had come full circle, a lifeline she'd never thought she'd need. "Thank you," she said simply, and meant it. The sentinels spent the next hour cleaning up. They hauled away the talon's trash, smoothed the torn earth, and even scrubbed the red paint off her fence with rags and turpentine Hawk pulled from his saddlebag. Maggie brewed coffee in her kitchen, the rich aroma mingling with the night air as she carried a tray out to them. They drank in silence, leaning against their bikes, the camaraderie of old warriors needing no words. Before they left, Hawk lingered on her porch. "They'll think twice before coming back," he said. "But if that developer tries anything else you call, we're not far." "I know," Maggie replied, resting a hand on his arm. "Take care, Danny." He tipped his head, mounted his bike, and led the sentinels out of Willow Hollow, their engines a fading rumble under the stars. Maggie stood there until the sound was gone, then turned back to her cottage. The lawn was scarred, her flowers trampled, but the house stood firm hers, still. The next morning, word of the clash spread through town like wildfire. At the diner, folks whispered over their eggs about the old nurse and her army, casting glances her way when she stopped in for her usual tea. The sheriff dropped by later, hat in hand, mumbling apologies for not acting sooner. Maggie waved him off. "Handled it myself," she said, and he didn't argue. Days turned to weeks, and the iron talons didn't return. The developer's offers stopped coming to rumor. Had it he'd pulled out after hearing about the Sentinel's visit, spooked by the prospect of more trouble. Willow Hollow settled back into its sleepy rhythm, porch swings creaking and pie tins clinking at the diner. Maggie replanted her garden, her hands shaky but sure as she pressed seeds into the soil. The zinnias wouldn't bloom again this year, but come spring, they'd rise stubborn, like her. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of amber, Maggie sat on her porch with a book in her lap. A letter from her youngest grandson lay open beside her, tied with its green ribbon. She traced the words with a finger, smiling at his tales of school and soccer, then looked out at the quiet hollow. The cottage creaked around her, a soft chorus of memories, James hammering nails into the frame, her children's laughter echoing down the hall, the steady hum of her life unfolding within these walls. She fought for this place, not just against the Talons or the developer, but against time itself. At 90, Maggie Callahan knew her days were numbered, but they were hers to spend here, in the home that held her heart. The war had shaped her, the years had tempered her, and now, this final stand had sealed her legacy. She closed her eyes, the breeze carrying the scent of marigolds, and felt a peace she hadn't known in months. The storm had passed. She was still standing.